Walk down any major street in San Francisco's financial district today, and you will notice something strange. Buildings that look like they belong above ground have windows at sidewalk level, windows that clearly were not designed to illuminate a basement. Look closer, and you will see ornate stonework, decorative frames, architectural details that make no sense for a foundation. These are not basement windows, they are ground floor windows, buried under several feet of earth and pavement. This is not isolated to one or two buildings. It is everywhere. Entire city blocks feature this pattern. Grand structures from the 1800s sit sunken into the earth, their true first floors lost beneath what we now call street level. And San Francisco is just the beginning. Travel north to Seattle, and you will find something even more bizarre. Beneath the modern city lies an entire ghost town, a complete underground network of sidewalks, storefronts, and passageways. The official story claims this underground Seattle was intentionally buried after the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, that the city simply decided to rebuild one story higher to solve drainage problems. But when you walk through these underground corridors today, when you see the scale of what was buried, the explanation starts to feel inadequate. We are not talking about covering over a few damaged buildings. We are talking about entombing an entire functioning city, complete with intricate architectural details, underground. Chicago tells a similar story, though the official narrative differs slightly. In the 1850s, city engineers claimed they needed to raise the street level by 14 feet to improve drainage and sewage systems. So they jacked up entire buildings, thousands of them, sometimes while businesses continued operating inside. They filled in the gaps with massive amounts of soil. Today, if you visit Chicago and know where to look, you can still find evidence of the old ground level, buried more than a decade's worth of accumulated earth below your feet. Cross the Atlantic to St. Petersburg, Russia, and the pattern continues. Magnificent buildings from the 1700s and 1800s have their ground floor windows sitting below modern street level. We are talking about structures built with meticulous craftsmanship, palaces and government buildings where every detail mattered. Yet, somehow, their architects supposedly forgot to account for 14 feet of future dirt accumulation. The Hermitage Museum, one of the largest and oldest museums in the world, sits partially sunken. Its foundation windows, clearly designed as first-floor entrances, now rest below grade. The same phenomenon appears in London, Paris, Rome, Prague, Budapest, and dozens of other cities across Europe and North America. Ornate doorways buried, decorative columns sunk into sidewalks, entire ground floors converted into dank basements, their windows now at ankle level for pedestrians walking above. The standard explanation goes something like this. Over centuries, cities naturally accumulate layers. Streets get resurfaced, buildings get demolished, and their rubble gets spread around. Organic waste piles up, rivers flood and leave silt deposits. Gradually, imperceptibly, the ground level rises. This process, called urban stratigraphy, is well documented. Rome sits on approximately 40 feet of its own history. Medieval streets in European cities often lie meters below modern ones. But here is where the official story starts to crack. The buildings we are talking about are not medieval. They are from the 1800s, just 150 to 200 years ago. And we are not talking about gradual accumulation over millennia. We are talking about massive, uniform burial of structures within a few decades. The math does not work. To bury a ground floor window under 10 to 15 feet of material in 50 years would require accumulation rates that dwarf anything seen in recorded history. Even more puzzling, this burial seems to have happened simultaneously across the globe. Cities on different continents, with different climates, different geological conditions, all experienced the same phenomenon during roughly the same time period, the mid to late 1800s. Seattle's fire happens in 1889. Chicago raises its streets in the 1850s. San Francisco's downtown gets its extra dirt around the same era. European cities report similar transformations during the Victorian age. And then there is the question nobody seems to ask. Where did all that dirt come from? To bury even a single city block under 10 feet of soil requires millions of tons of material. Multiply that across entire cities, across dozens of cities worldwide, and you are looking at an almost incomprehensible quantity of earth. The official explanations suggest it came from construction debris, from hillside excavations, from landfill projects, but the sheer volume strains credibility. Someone would have noticed. Someone would have documented the largest earth-moving operation in human history. Yet the historical record remains oddly silent about fleets of wagons dumping endless loads of dirt onto functioning city streets. Contemporary newspapers from the 1800s do mention street-raising projects, but they describe them as planned civic improvements, not responses to mysterious burial. They talk about engineering challenges, about the clever mechanisms used to lift buildings, but they never explain why such drastic measures became necessary in the first place. Why did cities across the world suddenly need to raise their streets by 10, 12, 14 feet? What changed? Some researchers have pointed to the Industrial Revolution, suggesting that new sewage requirements and modern plumbing necessitated higher street levels. But this explanation falls apart when you examine the timeline. Many of these buried buildings already had sophisticated plumbing and drainage systems. The architecture itself often displays engineering knowledge that seems advanced even by today's standards. These were not primitive structures being upgraded. They were magnificent buildings being entombed. Look at the photographic evidence from the 1860s through 1890s. Early photography captures these cities in transition. You can find images showing buildings half buried, with workers seemingly excavating down to reach old entrances, or alternatively, filling in around structures that sit too low. The captions on these old photos usually describe excavation work or street improvements, but they rarely explain the underlying reason. Why were these buildings at the wrong elevation to begin with? Here is what makes this truly unsettling. If you compiled every official explanation, every academic paper about urban development, every historical society's research on Victorian-era city planning, you would find a patchwork of local stories that never quite connect into a coherent global narrative. Each city has its own reason. Seattle had a fire, Chicago had drainage issues, San Francisco had earthquake rubble, even though the big earthquake did not happen until 1906. London had centuries of organic buildup, even though the buried buildings are clearly not centuries old. Every city offers a different answer, but they all share the same mysterious result. The buildings themselves whisper a different story. Their design language speaks of a world that understood something we have forgotten. Many of these structures feature unusual architectural elements, elaborate ventilation systems built into the walls, antenna-like spires and towers that serve no obvious decorative purpose, massive chimneys that seem oversized for simple heating, internal layouts that suggest purposes we can no longer identify, and almost universally, these buildings display a level of craftsmanship that declined sharply after the 1850s. It is as if the people who built them possessed knowledge or techniques that subsequent generations lost. What if the official explanations are not exactly wrong, but incomplete? What if something happened in the mid-1800s? Something significant enough to bury cities worldwide, but not dramatic enough to completely erase from the historical record. Or perhaps dramatic enough that the historical record itself needed to be carefully managed? Before we go further down this path, I want to take a moment to say thank you for being here. This channel, Tales Before Tesla, exists because people like you are willing to ask uncomfortable questions about the world we inherited. If you appreciate this kind of investigation, the kind that follows evidence wherever it leads, I would be grateful if you would subscribe and turn on notifications. We have a lot more ground to cover, literally and figuratively, and I think you will find what comes next even more startling. All right, let us continue. The pattern of buried buildings is not just an oddity, it is a clue. It suggests a specific moment in history when something changed, when the world as it had been was literally covered over and a new narrative was built on top. To understand what might have happened, we need to look beyond individual cities and examine the global evidence. We need to ask not just how these buildings got buried, but what else was buried with them. History, perhaps. Memory, certainly. And possibly, an entire civilization that we have been taught never existed. If buried buildings were the only anomaly, we could dismiss this as an interesting quirk of urban development. But they are not. Once you start looking, once you train your eye to see the pattern, evidence appears everywhere, and it all points to the same thing. a layer of mud, dirt, and sediment that covers the earth like a blanket, hiding what came before. Start with the star forts. These are geometric military fortifications found across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. You have seen them before, even if you did not know what they were called. Perfectly symmetrical structures with angular bastions radiating from a central point, creating star-shaped defensive positions. They appear in the Netherlands, Italy, France, Russia, and even in unexpected places like Sri Lanka and Japan. The official history attributes most of them to the 16 and 1700s, products of Renaissance military engineering. But here is the problem. Many of these star forts are buried. Not partially, not gradually over centuries, but suddenly and deeply. In some cases, the ramparts that once towered above the landscape now sit 10 to 15 feet below modern ground level. The defensive walls that were supposed to provide commanding views of approaching enemies are now at eye level or lower. This defeats their entire purpose. If these forts were built as functional military installations, why would anyone construct them in holes? And if they were not built in holes, what buried them? The standard explanation suggests centuries of natural accumulation, but the mathematics tell a different story. These forts are relatively young, 300 to 400 years old at most. Natural sedimentation rates, even in flood-prone areas, cannot account for this level of burial in such a short time frame. Unless something accelerated the process dramatically, unless these forts experienced an event that deposited massive amounts of material in a very short period. Move beyond the forts to the cities themselves, the ancient ones we supposedly understand. Take Rome, the eternal city, with its famous layers of history. Archaeologists love to point out that modern Rome sits on top of ancient Rome, which sits on top of even older settlements. They excavate down through distinct strata, each representing a different era. This layering makes sense over 2,000 years. What makes less sense is the composition of some of these layers. Between certain historical periods, researchers find thick deposits of silt and clay, homogeneous layers that show characteristics of rapid deposition, not the gradual accumulation of urban debris you would expect from a continuously inhabited city, but the kind of uniform sediment you associate with flooding. Large-scale flooding. The Tiber River gets blamed for these deposits, but the Tiber is not big enough or powerful enough to explain layers several meters thick spread across the entire city basin. Something bigger moved that much material. Petra, the rose-red city carved into Jordanian cliffs, tells a similar story. This marvel of ancient engineering, with its intricate facades cut directly into rock faces, sits partially buried in its own valley. The famous Treasury Building, the one you recognize from Indiana Jones, has its base hidden beneath accumulated sediment. Excavations have revealed that the plaza in front of these structures was once much lower, that the buildings were designed to tower above visitors, not meet them at mid-level. What filled in Petra's central valley? The official answer is flash floods carrying desert sediment over centuries. But the layer is deep, uniform, and shows signs of a single major deposition event rather than gradual accumulation. Then there is Derinkuyu in Turkey, an underground city carved from volcanic rock that could house 20,000 people. It features multiple levels descending hundreds of feet, with ventilation shafts, wells, communal spaces, and defensive mechanisms. The conventional dating places its construction around the 7th or 8th century, though some evidence suggests it could be much older. Here is what nobody talks about. This entire complex is underground not because it was built that way intentionally from the surface down, but because the surface level rose. The upper levels show architectural features, decorative elements, and functional designs that make no sense for subterranean construction. They were built for above-ground living and later became buried. This pattern repeats globally. In China, excavations of ancient cities reveal multiple buried layers, with Tang and Song dynasty structures sitting beneath meters of loess, the yellow silt that blankets much of northern China. The conventional explanation blames wind deposition from the Gobi Desert over millennia, but when you examine the stratigraphy closely, you find periods of rapid accumulation, thick layers deposited quickly rather than gradually. The Chinese historical record even mentions these events, describing years when the sky darkened and yellow rain fell from the heavens, though modern historians interpret these accounts as poetic exaggeration or localized dust storms. crossed the Pacific to the Americas, and the evidence continues. Mesoamerican pyramids and temples frequently show burial patterns. The stepped pyramid at Cholula in Mexico, one of the largest pyramids by volume in the world, was completely covered by earth and vegetation when Spanish conquistadors arrived. They thought it was a natural hill and built a church on top. Only later excavations revealed the massive structure beneath. The standard explanation suggests abandonment followed by natural overgrowth. But the sediment covering Cholula is not just vegetation and organic decay. It includes thick layers of clay and silt consistent with water deposition. In North America, mound builder sites across the Mississippi River Valley display similar characteristics. Many of these earthworks are attributed to indigenous cultures, like the Mississippian civilization, which flourished from around 800 to 1600 CE. But excavations of some mounds reveal something unexpected. Beneath the earthen mounds, there are sometimes stone structures, sophisticated architectural foundations that predate the mounds themselves. It is as if someone found existing buried buildings and built ceremonial mounds over them, mistaking ancient ruins for natural hills, just as the Spanish did at Cholula. Now, let us talk about the elephant in the room: Victorian-era excavations. If you examine historical records, newspapers, and city planning documents from the 1800s, you will find constant references to excavation projects. Not archaeological digs for ancient artifacts, but practical excavations to reach the basements of relatively recent buildings. Throughout Europe and North America, cities undertook massive earth removal operations to access lower levels of structures that were supposedly built just decades earlier. In London, the construction of the underground railway system in the 1860s required extensive excavation. Workers reported finding multiple layers of streets, older road surfaces stacked on top of each other, separated by thick deposits of clay and silt. Some of these buried streets were cobbled and intact, suggesting they had been quickly covered rather than gradually buried. The project documentation describes removing shocking quantities of fill dirt, material that had no clear origin. Where did it come from? Who put it there? The records do not say. Paris experienced similar discoveries during Baron Haussmann's renovation of the city in the mid-1800s. As workers carved out new boulevards and installed modern sewers, they uncovered older Paris beneath the streets. Multiple layers of previous construction, separated not by centuries of debris but by distinct strata of sediment. Haussmann's engineers documented finding buildings with their ground floors completely filled with hard-packed clay, as if someone had pumped mud into them and let it solidify. The official explanation suggested flood deposits from the Seine, but the Seine does not flood with that kind of force or frequency. Not naturally, anyway. New York City's subway excavations in the early 1900s revealed similar anomalies. Workers found wooden infrastructure, water mains, and building foundations at depths that did not match the historical timeline. Structures that should have been near the surface based on their age were buried under 15 to 20 feet of mixed fill. The composition of this fill puzzled engineers. It was not construction debris or garbage. It was clean earth, silt, and clay, as if someone had dumped massive quantities of river sediment onto the city streets. But when? And why does the historical record not mention such a monumental undertaking? Here is where things get really interesting. If you map these burial depths across different cities and try to correlate them with known historical events, floods, earthquakes, fires, the numbers do not add up. The depth of burial often exceeds what any documented disaster could explain. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 gets credit for necessitating the city's reconstruction and elevation, but the fire burned buildings, it did not bury them under 10 feet of dirt. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake caused tremendous destruction, but it happened after many of the city's buildings were already partially buried. Seattle's 1889 fire similarly gets blamed for the underground city, but fire does not deposit sediment. Fire removes material through combustion. It does not add earth. What could account for a global layer of mud? Several possibilities exist, and none of them are comfortable. A massive flood event, perhaps triggered by rapid glacial melting or a seismic ocean displacement, could deposit thick layers of sediment across continents. Historical records from various cultures mention great floods, but these accounts are usually dismissed as mythology or localized events. What if they were not? What if something happened in the relatively recent past, perhaps just 2 to 300 years ago, that was significant enough to bury civilizations but not quite catastrophic enough to end human society entirely? Another possibility involves volcanic activity on a scale we have not seen in modern recorded history. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia caused the year without a summer in 1816, disrupting weather patterns globally and causing crop failures. But Tambora also ejected massive quantities of ash into the atmosphere. What if Tambora was not an isolated event but part of a larger sequence? What if multiple major eruptions occurred in close succession, filling the atmosphere with particulate matter that eventually fell back to Earth as muddy precipitation? Historical accounts from the early 1800s do mention strange atmospheric phenomena: red skies, unusual weather, years of cold and darkness. We attribute these to Tambora alone, but what if there was more? Then there is the least discussed but perhaps most intriguing possibility: liquefaction on a massive scale. When water-saturated soil experiences seismic activity or certain electromagnetic disturbances, it can temporarily lose its solid properties and behave like a liquid. Entire landscapes can flow like water, burying structures, then resolidify once the triggering event passes. Localized liquefaction happens during earthquakes. We have documented cases. But what about global liquefaction? What kind of event could trigger that? A magnetic pole excursion, perhaps? Or a powerful solar storm interacting with Earth's magnetosphere? The Carrington event of 1859 demonstrated that the sun can throw electromagnetic punches strong enough to disrupt technology worldwide. What if an even larger solar event, one that predated our ability to measure and record it, caused geological effects we are only now beginning to understand? The evidence for a global mud layer exists. It sits beneath our feet, in every major city, documented in excavation reports, visible in buried buildings, present in the geological record. What we lack is not evidence, but an accepted explanation that accounts for all of it simultaneously. The pieces are there. We just need to be willing to assemble them into a picture that might challenge everything we think we know about recent history. Before we move forward, I am curious. Where are you listening to this from right now? What time is it where you are? Are you somewhere with old buildings nearby? Maybe ones with those strange basement windows we talked about earlier? Drop a comment and let me know your city and what time you are hearing this. I always wonder who is out there following these threads with me, maybe looking at their own surroundings a little differently now. Whether it is morning coffee or late night research time for you, I appreciate you being here for this investigation. Now, let us talk about something even stranger than buried buildings. Let us talk about the timeline itself and why the numbers might not add up the way we have been taught. Something strange happens when you start examining photographs from the mid-1800s. Not the subjects themselves, but what appears in the backgrounds. Buildings that look ancient, crumbling facades, structures half buried in earth, ruins that seem to have weathered centuries. The captions on these photos often describe them as recently constructed or currently in use, but your eyes tell a different story. These buildings look old, really old, as if they had already been standing for hundreds of years before the camera captured them. Take the photographs of San Francisco from the 1850s and 60s. The city was supposedly founded in 1776 as a Spanish mission, then exploded during the gold rush, starting in 1849. According to official history, most of San Francisco's downtown was built rapidly between 1850 and 1870. Yet photographs from 1860 show what appears to be a fully mature cityscape with weathered stone buildings, aged infrastructure, and architectural styles that suggest much longer timelines. Where did these structures actually come from? Who built them? And more importantly, when? The population numbers make even less sense. San Francisco's recorded population in 1848, before the gold rush, was approximately 1,000 people. By 1852, 4 years later, the population had exploded to 36,000. That is extraordinary growth, but here is the problem. The city that housed those 36,000 people featured hundreds of substantial brick and stone buildings, many of them multi-story structures with sophisticated architectural details. The mathematics of construction do not work, even with unlimited labor and resources. You cannot build that much that fast using 1850s technology. Each of those buildings would have required months or years of work. Stone must be quarried, transported, cut, and set. Bricks must be fired. Foundations must be dug and cured. Skilled craftsmen must execute the decorative elements. Yet somehow, San Francisco accomplished in a few years what should have taken decades. This pattern repeats across America. Chicago in 1830 had a population of fewer than 100 people. By 1850, it claimed 30,000 residents and featured substantial downtown infrastructure that looked generations old. New York's explosive growth in the early 1800s similarly resulted in a cityscape that appeared far more mature than the timeline should allow. It is as if these cities were not built, but uncovered, as if the buildings were already there, waiting to be reoccupied. Then there are the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported from East Coast cities to the American Midwest and beyond through a program organized by the Children's Aid Society. The official narrative describes these as orphans from overcrowded cities, children whose parents had died or could not care for them. Charitable organizations placed them with farm families who needed labor. A heartwarming story of rescue and opportunity, the way it is usually told, but dig into the details and questions emerge. 250,000 orphans? Over 75 years, that averages more than 3,000 children per year. Where did they all come from? The death rates and poverty levels in East Coast cities, while certainly serious, do not explain such enormous numbers of parentless children. And the program's records are remarkably vague about the origins of these children. Many had no documentation, no birth certificates, no family histories. They were simply there, in orphanages and on the streets, with no clear explanation of where they came from or what happened to their parents. Some researchers have noted something odd about orphan train photographs. The children often appear well-dressed, clean, and healthy, not the malnourished street urchins you might expect. Their clothing, though simple, shows quality craftsmanship. Their faces do not display the signs of long-term malnutrition or abuse. They look like normal children who simply had no parents. As if an entire generation of children somehow appeared without families, needing to be redistributed across a sparsely populated continent. Around the same time, immigration to America reached unprecedented levels. Between 1840 and 1860, more than 4 million immigrants arrived, primarily from Ireland and Germany. The Irish potato famine explains some of this, but not all. German immigration during this period often gets attributed to political unrest and economic hardship, but the scale seems disproportionate. It is as if America needed to be rapidly repopulated, as if there were empty cities waiting for inhabitants. The World's Fairs of the late 1800s and early 1900s add another layer of mystery. These expositions featured breathtaking architecture, massive neoclassical buildings, elaborate palaces, grand pavilions with intricate decorative elements. The official story claims these were temporary structures, built from plaster and wood frames, designed to last only for the duration of the fair before being demolished. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, the 1915 San Francisco Panama Pacific Exposition, all featured what appeared to be permanent architecture of the highest quality, yet almost all of it was destroyed shortly after the fairs ended. Look at photographs of these World's Fairs and try to convince yourself you are looking at temporary buildings made of plaster. The White City in Chicago featured more than 200 buildings spanning over 600 acres. The structures displayed architectural sophistication that rivaled Europe's finest permanent buildings. Massive domes, sweeping colonnades, detailed sculptural elements, advanced electrical systems. One photograph shows the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, which covered more than 30 acres under a single roof and could hold 300,000 people. This was supposedly a temporary structure that took just 2 years to build and was torn down immediately after the fair. Why would anyone construct such magnificent buildings only to destroy them? The official explanation suggests they were meant to inspire, to show what future cities could become, then removed to make way for practical development. But this explanation feels insufficient when you consider the resources invested. These fairs required enormous amounts of material, labor, and expertise. The White City alone used more than 65,000 tons of staff, a plaster and fiber mixture, except staff does not weather like plaster. In photographs taken during rainstorms at these fairs, the buildings show no deterioration. Water runs off them as if they were stone. Here is an alternative interpretation that some researchers have proposed. What if these buildings were not temporary constructions, but existing structures that were rediscovered, cleaned up, and repurposed for the fairs? What if the world's fairs were actually unveiling ceremonies, revealing architecture that had been recently excavated from the mud layer? And what if the subsequent demolition was not destruction but reburial, covering up evidence of whoever built these magnificent structures originally? It sounds far-fetched until you examine what happened after the fairs. In Chicago, fires destroyed much of the White City. In San Francisco, the Panama Pacific Exposition was demolished, and the site was covered with landfill to create the Marina District. In St. Louis, most of the fair buildings were torn down within a year. Very little physical evidence remains. No substantial ruins. No repurposed buildings serving other functions. Just empty lots and modern development where these architectural marvels once stood. It is almost as if someone wanted to ensure no trace remained for future investigation. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 presents similar questions. It destroyed approximately 3 square miles of the city, decimated 17,000 structures, and left 100,000 people homeless. The fire started on October 8th and burned for 2 days. The official cause was supposedly a cow kicking over a lantern in a barn, though this story has been disputed. What gets less attention is how the fire spread. Chicago in 1871 was supposedly built primarily of wood, which explains the rapid spread, but photographs taken before the fire show substantial stone and brick construction in the downtown area. Many of these buildings should have survived, yet they did not. The fire burned so hot it melted metal and cracked stone. Witnesses reported flames that behaved strangely, burning underground through the clay soil, spreading through sewers and foundations. Does wood fire do that? The fire occurred during a period of unusual atmospheric conditions. That same night, October 8, 1871, multiple massive fires broke out across the Midwest. The Peshtigo Fire in Wisconsin killed more than 1,000 people, far more than Chicago's 300 casualties. Fires also erupted in Michigan, consuming entire towns, all on the same night. The official explanation blames drought conditions and high winds. But the geographic distribution of these simultaneous fires, the reported behavior of the flames, and the unusual atmospheric phenomena witnesses described, including strange lights in the sky and a peculiar smell in the air, suggest something more unusual might have been happening. After the Chicago fire, the city rebuilt rapidly. Within 2 years, most of the destroyed area featured new construction. But here is what is odd. The new buildings often incorporated foundations and lower levels that survived the fire. These surviving elements frequently show architectural styles and construction techniques that seem older, more sophisticated than what the 1870s timeline would suggest. It is as if the fire cleared away upper stories of ancient buildings, exposing their bases, which were then built upon without question or documentation. Newspaper archives from the 1800s reveal their own anomalies. Large gaps appear in the historical record, years where archives are suspiciously thin or missing entirely. The explanation usually involves fires, floods, or simple neglect destroying old papers. But the pattern of these gaps is interesting. They cluster around the mid-1800s, exactly when all these other strange events occurred. And when newspapers from this period do survive, they sometimes contain stories that do not fit our understanding of the era. Reports of unusual weather, strange lights in the sky, electromagnetic disturbances, unexplained ruins being discovered, and archaeological findings that never made it into official history books. Then there is the calendar issue. Most people know that the Gregorian calendar replaced the Julian calendar and that this transition involves skipping days. When Catholic countries adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1582, they jumped forward 10 days to realign with solar cycles. Protestant countries adopted it later, some not until the 1700s. Russia did not switch until 1918, after the revolution. But calendar reform involved more than just skipping days. It involved redefining how years were counted, which events served as reference points, and how historical chronology was organized. Some researchers argue that calendar reforms might have been more extensive than officially acknowledged, that years could have been added or removed from the historical record to create apparent continuity where gaps existed. This is admittedly controversial territory, and the evidence is circumstantial. But consider this: if something catastrophic happened in the relatively recent past, something that destroyed records and disrupted civilization, the survivors would need to reconstruct a timeline. They would need to account for the ruins they found, the structures they inherited, the artifacts they discovered. They would need to create a narrative that made sense of a world that had clearly been more advanced than their present circumstances. And perhaps, in creating that narrative, they extended the past further backward than it actually reached, made ancient empires older than they were, stretched timelines to accommodate architectural achievements that seemed impossible for the recent past. What if 200 years are missing from our history? Not removed, but never actually experienced in the way we think. What if the 1800s were not a time of building new civilizations, but of rediscovering and repopulating old ones? The evidence does not prove this conclusively, but it certainly raises the question, and once you start asking that question, everything about the official timeline begins to look suspect. So let us say, just for a moment, that the evidence is pointing to something real, that cities were buried, populations disappeared, and timelines do not match up. The natural next question is the hardest one. What could actually do this? What kind of event could bury civilizations across the entire planet, disrupt the historical record, and leave us picking up pieces we barely understand? We need to look at real science here, not speculation for its own sake, but documented phenomena that have happened before and could happen again. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. Earth has experienced catastrophic events in the past, sudden, violent, civilization-ending events, and the timescale between them might be shorter than we would like to believe. Let us start with the sun. We live our entire lives bathed in its light, trusting it to rise each morning, assuming it will behave predictably. But the sun is not stable. It is a roiling ball of nuclear fusion with a magnetic field that flips, twists, and occasionally releases energy in ways that would make our worst nightmares look tame. In 1859, astronomer Richard Carrington observed what we now call the Carrington event. A massive solar flare erupted from the sun's surface, and within 18 hours, Earth's magnetosphere was slammed by a coronal mass ejection. Telegraph systems worldwide sparked, caught fire, and shocked operators. Auroras appeared as far south as the Caribbean. The skies lit up so brightly that people in the Rocky Mountains woke up thinking it was dawn and started making breakfast at 2 in the morning. That was with 1850s technology, a handful of telegraph wires. Imagine the same event hitting us today, with our satellite networks, power grids, and electronic infrastructure. Estimates suggest a Carrington-level event now would cause trillions of dollars in damage and take years to recover from. But here's what keeps scientists awake at night. The Carrington event was not even close to the worst the sun can do. Ice core data from Greenland shows evidence of solar events far more powerful. Around 775 CE, something hit Earth that left radioactive isotope signatures in tree rings and ice cores. Whatever it was dumped so much energy into the atmosphere that it dwarfed anything in recorded history. Some researchers believe it was a solar superstorm, orders of magnitude stronger than Carrington. Others think it might have been a supernova from a relatively nearby star. Either way, it was catastrophic, and the geological record shows these events are not unique. They happen. Not often, but they happen. Now imagine a solar event not just powerful, but sustained. A micronova, a term that is starting to gain traction in astrophysics, refers to a periodic ejection of the sun's outer layers. Not enough to destroy the star itself, but enough to scour the inner solar system with plasma, radiation, and electromagnetic fury. Some researchers, looking at cycles in solar behavior and correlating them with extinction events in Earth's past, suggest these micronovas might occur on a cycle, perhaps every 12,000 years, perhaps more frequently. What would a solar micronova do to Earth? First, the electromagnetic pulse would fry anything electronic instantly, but, more fundamentally, it would interact with Earth's magnetosphere and ionosphere in catastrophic ways. The The atmosphere itself could become electrified. Auroras would not just appear at the poles but across the entire sky. The sheer energy dumped into the upper atmosphere could create hurricane-force winds globally, and if enough plasma reached the surface, it could literally ignite organic material. Forests would burn, oceans would churn, and in the aftermath, atmospheric moisture mixing with ash and debris would fall as muddy rain. Thick, heavy, coating everything. This is not science fiction. We know plasma events can do this because we have observed them on other planets. Jupiter's moon Io experiences constant plasma bombardment from Jupiter's magnetosphere, and its surface shows the results. Layers of sulfur compounds deposited by atmospheric fallout. Now scale that to Earth, and you have a mechanism for the global mud layer. But there is another possibility, one that does not require the sun to misbehave. Earth's magnetic field itself might be the culprit. Right now, as you listen to this, Earth's magnetic North Pole is moving, not slowly, not imperceptibly, but rapidly. It has accelerated from about 15 kilometers per year to 55 kilometers per year. The field strength has decreased by about 10% over the last century and a half. These are signs of something big potentially happening. A magnetic pole reversal. The geological record shows Earth's magnetic field has reversed many times. North becomes south, south becomes north. It has happened hundreds of times over Earth's history. The average time between reversals is about 300,000 years, but the timing is irregular. Some happen within 10,000 years of each other. The last full reversal was about 780,000 years ago. We are overdue, statistically speaking. Here is what most people do not realize about magnetic reversals. They do not happen instantly. The field does not just flip overnight. Instead, it weakens, becomes chaotic, and goes through a period of instability that can last hundreds or even thousands of years. During this transition, Earth's magnetic field, which normally shields us from solar radiation and cosmic rays, becomes fragmentary. Multiple north and south poles can exist simultaneously. The field strength drops to as low as 10% of normal. Without that shield, radiation levels at the surface increase dramatically. But more relevant to our topic, a weakened magnetic field allows solar wind to penetrate deeper into the atmosphere. This creates unusual electromagnetic conditions at ground level. And here is where things get interesting for our mud flood hypothesis. When electromagnetic fields interact with water-saturated soil, they can induce liquefaction. The ground literally loses its solid properties. Research into earthquake liquefaction has shown this process clearly. When seismic waves pass through water-saturated sediment, the vibrations increase pore water pressure, causing soil particles to lose contact with each other. The ground behaves like a liquid. Buildings sink, landscapes flow. Then, when the shaking stops, everything resolidifies in its new configuration. But what if the triggering mechanism was not seismic waves but electromagnetic disturbances from a destabilized magnetosphere? What if a geomagnetic excursion, a temporary weakening and scrambling of Earth's field, caused widespread liquefaction across the planet? This could explain the uniform burial depths. If soil across multiple continents liquefied simultaneously, structures would sink to similar depths based on their weight and foundation design. Then, as the electromagnetic disturbance passed and the soil resolidified, everything would be locked in place, buried but intact. And any water present during liquefaction would be squeezed to the surface, carrying fine sediments with it, depositing that characteristic layer of mud we see in the geological record. The timing is intriguing. The most recent geomagnetic excursion, called the Lashamp event, occurred about 41,000 years ago, but there have been smaller excursions more recently. The Mono Lake excursion around 34,000 years ago, and some researchers argue for more recent, less documented events. Could one have occurred in the early 1800s? The historical record from that period does mention unusual magnetic phenomena, compass needles behaving erratically, strange auroras at unusual latitudes, and let us not forget the Carrington event in 1859, which demonstrated just how vulnerable we are to electromagnetic disturbances. Then there is the impact hypothesis. We know impacts happen, we have craters to prove it. The Tunguska event in 1908 flattened 2,000 square kilometers of Siberian forest with an airburst from a relatively small asteroid or comet fragment. No crater was left because the object exploded in the atmosphere, but the devastation was immense. Now imagine something larger, or multiple impacts occurring in close succession. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that around 12,800 years ago, a comet or asteroid broke up and struck Earth in multiple locations. The impacts would have thrown enormous amounts of debris into the atmosphere, triggering a rapid return to Ice Age conditions that lasted more than 1,000 years. Evidence for this event includes a thin layer of sediment across North America, containing high concentrations of platinum, tiny diamonds formed under high pressure, and spherules, small glass beads created when rock is vaporized and then cools. This layer also contains charcoal, suggesting widespread fires, and above this layer, there is a sharp decline in archaeological evidence of human habitation. Civilizations, or at least populations, declined dramatically right at this boundary. Could something similar have happened more recently? If an impact or impacts occurred over oceans, they would not leave obvious craters, but they would create mega tsunamis, walls of water hundreds of feet high, racing across continents, carrying sediment, debris, and anything in their path. When those waves receded, they would leave behind thick deposits of mud, burying coastal cities and anything near major river systems. An oceanic impact would also explain why the historical record might be unclear. Most of the direct evidence would be underwater, and the survivors would be inland populations with fragmented knowledge of what happened. Mythologies from around the world describe exactly this scenario. The flood narratives are not unique to the Bible. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a great flood sent by the gods. Hindu texts describe Manu surviving a flood that destroyed humanity. Greek mythology has Deucalion's flood. Chinese legends speak of Gunyu taming the great floods. Norse mythology describes a flood at Ragnarok. Indigenous American tribes across both continents have flood stories. These accounts share common elements: sudden onset, divine or celestial cause, few survivors, a world transformed. Mainstream archaeology treats these as separate cultural myths, symbolic stories not meant to describe literal events. But what if they are cultural memories of the same event, passed down through generations until writing systems could record them? The details differ because each culture interpreted the experience through its own lens, but the core event, a catastrophic flood that reshaped the world, remains consistent. We also need to consider volcanic activity, though perhaps not in the way you might expect. 1815 gave us Mount Tambora, the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded history. It ejected so much material into the atmosphere that it caused the year without a summer in 1816. Crops failed globally. Snow fell in New England in June. Temperatures dropped worldwide. Tambora alone demonstrates how volcanic activity can affect the entire planet. But what if Tambora was not isolated? What if the early 1800s saw a cluster of major eruptions? Volcanic winters could last years, depending on how much material enters the stratosphere. And volcanic ash mixed with atmospheric moisture falls as muddy precipitation, heavy, thick, accumulating rapidly. Historical accounts from the 18 teens and 20s do describe strange weather, failed harvests, and unusual atmospheric conditions. Red and brown snow, muddy rain, skies that stayed dark for extended periods. We tend to think of these explanations as competing theories: solar event or magnetic excursion or impact or volcanism. But what if they are connected? What if one triggers the others? A large impact could trigger volcanic eruptions along fault lines. Volcanic eruptions could inject material into the atmosphere that increases electrical conductivity, making the planet more vulnerable to solar disturbances. A weakened magnetic field could allow more cosmic radiation to reach the surface, potentially triggering seismic activity through mechanisms we do not fully understand yet. Earth is a system. When one part is disrupted, cascading effects follow. The geological record shows these connections. Mass extinction events often correlate with multiple simultaneous stressors. The end of the dinosaurs involved not just an impact but also massive volcanic eruptions from the Deccan Traps. The Permian extinction, the worst in Earth's history, coincided with the Siberian Traps eruptions. Possible impact events: and rapid climate change. When Earth gets hit, it gets hit hard and from multiple directions. So, which theory is correct? The honest answer is we do not know for certain, but we also do not need to choose just one. The evidence suggests something catastrophic happened in the relatively recent past, something that deposited a global layer of sediment, buried cities, disrupted civilizations, and forced survivors to rebuild with incomplete knowledge of what came before. Whether that something was solar, magnetic, impact-related, volcanic, or all of the above, the result is what matters: a reset. A moment when the world changed, and everything that came before was literally covered up. The question is not whether it could happen. The science shows it could. The question is whether it did happen recently enough that we are still living in its shadow, still uncovering its evidence, still piecing together what was lost. Open an atlas from the 17 or 1800s, and you might find something that does not appear on modern maps. A vast territory spanning much of northern Asia, labeled simply as Tartaria or sometimes Tartary. Not a small region, not a minor footnote. A massive expanse covering what we now call Siberia, parts of Central Asia, and extending into regions we associate with Russia, Mongolia, and China. The borders shift depending on which map you consult, but the name appears consistently across European cartography for centuries. Then, sometime around the late 1800s, it vanishes, not gradually absorbed into other nations, but erased, as if it never existed. The conventional explanation is straightforward. Tartaria was not a unified empire, but a vague European term for the largely unmapped territories of Central and Northern Asia. A catch-all label for regions beyond European knowledge, inhabited by various nomadic peoples the Europeans collectively called Tartars or Tatars. As exploration improved and knowledge expanded, the generic term was replaced with more accurate geographic and political designations. Simple case of cartographic evolution. Nothing mysterious. Except the maps tell a more complex story. Many of them do not depict Tartaria as blank, unexplored space. They show cities, trade routes, political boundaries. Some maps distinguish between different Tartarias: Muscovite Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. These are not markings for unknown wastelands. They are designations for organized territories. And the timing of Tartaria's disappearance from maps coincides suspiciously with our mud flood timeline. By the early 1900s, Tartaria is gone from cartography, replaced with the political boundaries we recognize today. Now, before we go further, we need to be very clear about something. The idea that Tartaria was an advanced globe spanning empire with free energy technology and architecture far beyond anything we see today is speculation. It is a theory that has gained substantial attention online, but it is not proven. What we can say with certainty is that something called Tartaria existed in the cartographic record, and our understanding of what that actually represented is surprisingly unclear. The architecture angle is where things get genuinely interesting, though. Look at the buildings constructed in the 17 and 1800s across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Not the simple structures, but the grand ones. Cathedrals, government buildings, train stations, exhibition halls. They share a remarkable consistency in style. Neoclassical elements, ornate details, massive scale, high ceilings, elaborate ventilation systems, and unusual features that do not quite make sense for their stated purpose. Take the spires and towers. Almost every significant building from this era features prominent vertical elements. Tall spires, ornate towers, decorative pinnacles reaching skyward. The official explanation is purely aesthetic, architectural flourish in the Baroque or neoclassical tradition. But some researchers have noted these structures bear resemblance to electrical antennas. Metallic elements, often gilded, positioned at the highest points, sometimes with elaborate metalwork that looks suspiciously like the coil designs used in early electrical experiments. Could these buildings have served a dual purpose? Architecture and energy collection? It sounds far-fetched until you remember that the science of atmospheric electricity was well understood in the 17 and 1800s. Benjamin Franklin's experiments proved lightning was electrical. Scientists of that era knew the atmosphere carried charge. They built atmospheric electricity collectors, devices that gathered ambient electrical potential from the air. These were not fringe experiments. They were mainstream science, at least until the fossil fuel and centralized power generation became dominant paradigms. Some of these old buildings also feature extremely sophisticated plumbing and climate control systems. The Palace of Westminster in London, completed in 1870, had a ventilation system so advanced it could regulate temperature and humidity throughout the entire structure, using only passive airflow and water evaporation. No electricity required. The design was so effective that modern engineers study it. How did Victorian-era architects achieve climate control sophistication that we struggle to replicate efficiently today? Or consider the pneumatic tube systems that riddled major cities in the late 1800s. Paris, London, New York, Berlin, all had networks of pressurized tubes that could shoot messages and small packages across the city faster than modern internet speeds for simple text transmission. These systems worked through air pressure alone, no electricity needed. The technology was brilliant, efficient, and then abandoned in favor of electrical telecommunications. Why? If it worked so well, why replace it? The Tartaria theory suggests these architectural features were not innovations of the 1800s but inheritances, that the buildings attributed to this era were actually much older, products of a more advanced civilization that understood energy and engineering in ways we have forgotten. That the 1800s were not an age of construction but of reoccupation and retrofitting. This is where we have to pump the brakes. There is a difference between asking interesting questions about architecture and claiming to have definitive answers. The evidence that these buildings are older than their documented construction dates is thin. We have construction records, photographs of buildings being built, contemporary accounts. The 1850s photo archives show scaffolding, work crews, buildings in various stages of completion. Unless we assume all of that documentation is fabricated, which enters territory that is difficult to defend, we have to accept that at least some of these buildings were constructed when the records claim. But, and this is important, accepting that buildings were constructed in the 1800s does not mean the techniques, knowledge, or even the base materials were developed in the 1800s. Craftsmen could have been working from older plans, copying designs they found, utilizing techniques passed down through guild systems that dated back further than we realize. The Freemasons, after all, traced their organizational lineage to medieval stonemason guilds. What knowledge did those guilds preserve? What techniques did they pass down through generations? There is also the question of material sourcing. Where did all the granite come from? The marble? The massive timbers? These materials had to be quarried, transported, and worked by hand or with primitive machinery. The logistics of building even one of these structures, let alone hundreds of them simultaneously across multiple continents, are staggering. You would need quarries operating at enormous scale, transportation networks that could move millions of tons of stone, and skilled labor forces numbering in the thousands per project. Where are the records of these quarries? Where are the industrial sites that should have supported this level of construction? Some researchers point to photographs of quarries from the 1800s and note they seem surprisingly small for the amount of material these buildings would require. Others note that many old quarries show evidence of much older workings, ancient chisel marks beneath more recent excavations. Could the 1800s builders have been mining already cut stone, recycling material from earlier structures that were buried or destroyed? This brings us back to the mud flood connection. If a catastrophic event buried a previous civilization's infrastructure, survivors would have access to an enormous amount of pre-cut building material. They would just need to excavate it. The buried buildings we discussed earlier, the ones with ground floors under street level, could have served as both problem and solution. Problem because they were in the way, solution because they provided free building material. Excavate the buried structures, salvage what you can, and incorporate it into new construction. This would explain the apparent speed of building in the 1800s. They were not starting from scratch. They were rebuilding with recycled materials. The term Tartaria itself might be a key, not to a specific empire, but to a way of understanding history. European scholars in the 15, 16, and 1700s had a frustrating habit of lumping together anything beyond their immediate knowledge. The Orient, the New World, Tartary. These were categories of otherness, places where the rules might be different, where marvels and mysteries resided. As European power expanded and exploration mapped the globe, these vague categories got replaced with specific knowledge. But what if Tartaria represented not ignorance but a memory? A cultural recollection of a time when the regions we now call Russia, Central Asia, and Siberia were more densely populated, more developed, more connected than the scattered nomadic tribes Europeans encountered in the 17 and 1800s? What if something had happened to depopulate those regions, to bury their cities, to reduce thriving civilizations to wandering remnants? The Europeans arriving afterward would see ruins, hear stories, and create a map label, Tartaria, the land of the Tartars, not realizing they were documenting the aftermath of a collapse. Indigenous oral histories from Siberian peoples speak of great cities in the past, of times when the land was different, when the climate was milder, when ancestors lived in permanent settlements with stone buildings. Mainstream anthropology treats these as myths, symbolic stories not meant as literal history. But what if they are memories? What if these oral traditions preserve knowledge of what Tartaria actually was? We are left with fragments, maps that show something that official history says was never really there, architecture that seems too sophisticated for its era, oral traditions that describe lost civilizations, and a pattern of burial and forgetting that aligns with our mudflood evidence. None of this proves a Tartarian empire existed in the form some researchers claim, but it does suggest our understanding of recent history, particularly in Central Asia, is incomplete. That something more was there, and something happened to it. The Tartaria question ultimately is not about proving a specific civilization existed. It is about recognizing that absence of evidence in mainstream history does not always mean evidence of absence. It means we should look harder, question more carefully, and remain open to the possibility that the world of 200 or 300 years ago was significantly different from what we have been taught. Not alien, not impossibly advanced, but different, more complex, and perhaps more fragile than we would like to believe. When you start piecing together evidence of buried cities, missing timelines, and forgotten civilizations, one question naturally emerges. If something this significant happened, why do we not know about it? Not in the vague mythological sense, but in the documented historical sense. Where are the newspaper accounts describing cities being buried? Where are the survivor testimonies? Where are the government reports addressing a global catastrophe? And if those records existed and then disappeared, who benefited from their disappearance? Let us be very careful here. The moment you say cover up, you enter territory where critical thinking often goes to die. It is easy to assume malicious conspiracy when the simpler answer might be chaos, incompetence, or the natural degradation of information over time. But it is equally naive to assume that powerful institutions always act transparently, or that historical narratives are never shaped by those who have something to gain from specific interpretations of the past. So let us ask directly, who would benefit from burying the evidence of a global catastrophe and the advanced civilization it destroyed? Start with the most obvious answer: whoever controlled the land afterward. If you are standing in the ruins of a sophisticated city, surrounded by architecture you cannot replicate, holding legal documents and property records that make no sense because half the buildings are underground and the previous owners are gone, you have a problem. A legal problem, a political problem, and potentially a very profitable opportunity. The 1800s saw an explosion of property claims, land grants, and territorial expansion, particularly in North America. Manifest destiny was not just an ideology. It was a legal framework that justified taking land based on the assumption that it was either empty or occupied by people who had no legitimate claim to it. But what if that land was not empty? What if it contained buried infrastructure from a previous civilization? You cannot claim virgin territory if someone else's buildings are sticking out of the ground. But you can claim it if those buildings are declared ancient ruins of unknown origin, or better yet, if they are simply not mentioned at all in the official record. Look at the Homestead Act of 1862. It granted 160 acres of public land to anyone who would settle and improve it. Millions of acres were distributed this way. But whose land was it originally? The government claimed it was public domain, taken from Native American tribes through treaties of questionable legitimacy. But some of those homesteads featured strange anomalies: buried foundations, stone ruins, earthworks that predated any documented settlement. Homesteaders found these things, and most simply built on top of them, asking no questions because questions might complicate their legal claim. Insurance records from the 1800s reveal another interesting pattern, or rather, the absence of one. If massive portions of cities were buried under mud, if ground floors became basements overnight, if property values were literally buried, you would expect insurance claims. Lots of them. Property insurance existed in the 1800s. It was a growing industry, yet there is a curious lack of large-scale claims related to burial or subsidence beyond localized incidents. Either the burial happened gradually enough that insurance did not apply, or it happened in a way that made claims impossible to file, or the claims were filed and later removed from the record. The Victorian era also marked the beginning of standardized public education systems. Before the mid-1800s, education was localized, often religious, and highly varied. Then, relatively suddenly, governments across Europe and North America implemented mandatory schooling with standardized curricula. The stated purpose was literacy, civic participation, and workforce preparation for the industrial age. But standardized education also means standardized history. It means centralized control over what gets taught about the past. If you wanted to ensure that knowledge of a previous civilization did not spread through the population, you would do exactly this. You would create a single narrative of history, teach it to every child, and within 2 or 3 generations, alternative understandings would fade into fringe belief or forgotten entirely. This is not necessarily malicious. It could simply be pragmatic. Societies emerging from catastrophe need cohesion. Shared myths, agreed upon timelines. Questions about missing centuries or lost civilizations create uncertainty, and uncertainty makes governance difficult. Then there is the Smithsonian Institution, which has become a focal point for alternative history researchers, fairly or not. The Smithsonian was founded in 1846 and quickly became America's primary repository for archaeological and historical artifacts. It also developed a reputation, deserved or not, for losing things. Artifacts that do not fit the established narrative have a way of disappearing into the Smithsonian's vast collections, never to be displayed or studied publicly. The most cited example involves giant skeletons. Newspaper accounts from the late 1800s and early 1900s frequently describe archaeological discoveries of human remains, 7, 8, even 9 feet tall. These accounts appear in reputable papers, describe specific locations, and include measurements. Then the remains supposedly get shipped to the Smithsonian, and that is where the trail ends. No public displays, no further study. Requests to examine these specimens are met with claims that records are lost or that the remains never existed. Now, it is entirely possible these newspaper accounts were exaggerations, mistakes, or hoaxes. Journalism standards were different then, but the pattern of acquire and disappear raises questions. Whether or not the Smithsonian deliberately suppressed evidence, and there is no conclusive proof that they did, the institution does represent a bottleneck of information. When one organization controls access to physical evidence, that organization also controls the narrative built from that evidence. And institutions, like individuals, have biases, they have reputations to protect, they have funding sources to satisfy. Academic careers are built on supporting existing frameworks, not overturning them. The incentive structure pushes toward conservation of established narratives, not revolution. Economic incentives matter as well. The Industrial Revolution required resources: coal, iron, timber, labor. It also required markets and justification for rapid expansion. If the 1800s were truly an age of rebuilding rather than initial building, if the infrastructure was already partially there waiting to be excavated and repurposed, then the economic narrative of the era changes significantly. The titans of industry were not creating from nothing. They were exploiting what already existed. That is a less heroic story, less suitable for the mythology of self-made men and industrial progress. Energy technology provides another motive. Nikola Tesla's experiments with wireless power transmission and atmospheric electricity harvesting threatened to upend the centralized power generation model that was rapidly becoming the foundation of industrial wealth. Tesla claimed he could provide electricity to anyone, anywhere, without wires, drawing power from the Earth's natural electrical field. His financiers, notably J.P. Morgan, withdrew support when they realized this technology could not be metered and controlled. If you cannot control access, you cannot profit from it. Now, what if Tesla was not inventing but rediscovering? What if the atmospheric electricity harvesting he proposed was how those old cathedrals and civic buildings actually functioned? What if the spires and metalwork were not decorative but functional components of a distributed energy system? Suppressing that knowledge, if it existed, would be essential to maintaining the profitability of fossil fuels and centralized power generation. You do not need a grand conspiracy. You just need financial interests aligned against decentralized energy, and those interests were substantial. But let us apply Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is often correct. Is it simpler to believe in a coordinated global cover-up involving governments, academic institutions, and industrial powers working together to hide evidence of a lost civilization? Or is it simpler to believe that after a catastrophic event, survivors simply did what survivors do? They rebuilt with what they had, created narratives that made sense of their circumstances, and moved forward. Information was lost not through malicious suppression, but through the natural chaos of societal collapse and reconstruction. Human psychology favors the latter. We are pattern-seeking creatures, but we are also narrative-driven. When faced with inexplicable ruins and incomplete records, our ancestors would have created explanatory stories. Those stories become history. And once a narrative is established, especially if it is written into textbooks and taught to children, it becomes truth by consensus, not truth by evidence, but truth by repetition. Yet, even Occam's razor has limits. Sometimes the simpler explanation actually is that powerful people shape the narrative to benefit themselves. This happens. It has happened throughout history. The winners write the history books, not because of some nefarious plot, but because they are the ones left standing with the resources to do so. The losers, the buried civilizations, the forgotten peoples, they leave only ruins. And ruins can be interpreted any way the interpreter chooses. So who benefited? Landowners, governments, industrialists, academic institutions, anyone whose power depended on the established order and the narratives supporting it. Did they actively conspire to hide the truth? Probably not in some coordinated way. But did they benefit from certain questions not being asked, certain evidence not being examined too closely, certain narratives remaining unchallenged? Absolutely. And that passive benefit, that gentle pressure toward conformity, can be just as effective as active suppression. Sometimes more so, because it is harder to identify and challenge. The cover-up, if there was one, might not have been a cover-up at all, just a collective forgetting, encouraged by those who had nothing to gain from remembering. The fascinating thing about mysteries is that they do not stay buried forever. Technology advances. New tools reveal what was hidden, and sometimes, the establishment itself provides the evidence that challenges its own narratives, not intentionally, but because discovery does not care about ideology. Take Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. When it was first properly excavated starting in the mid-1990s, it shattered assumptions about human civilization. Here was a massive stone temple complex, featuring intricately carved pillars arranged in circular formations, some weighing up to 20 tons. The dating came back at around 9600 BCE. That makes it roughly 11,600 years old. To put that in perspective, Göbekli Tepe was already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were built. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates agriculture, at least according to what we thought we knew about agriculture. The conventional timeline placed hunter-gatherers in this era. Small nomadic bands without the organization, technology, or motivation to build monumental architecture. Yet here it was, complex stonework, astronomical alignments, artistic sophistication, and perhaps most challenging to the old narrative, it was deliberately buried. Someone, at some point, carefully filled in the entire complex with earth, preserving it until modern excavation. Why would a society invest enormous labor into building something extraordinary, use it for a period, and then intentionally bury it? We do not have a good answer. But it establishes precedent. Advanced structures get buried. It has happened before. Gunung Padang in Indonesia tells a similar story. What was long dismissed as a natural hill turned out to be a stepped pyramid covered in earth and vegetation. Ground-penetrating radar and core samples revealed constructed layers beneath the surface, some dating back potentially 20,000 years or more, though those dates remain hotly contested. If the older dates hold up to scrutiny, we are looking at sophisticated construction from a time when humans were supposedly just figuring out basic tool use. The Indonesian government has continued excavation despite significant pushback from establishment archaeology. The resistance is telling. When evidence challenges the timeline, the response is often to attack the methodology rather than examine the implications. Ground-penetrating radar has become a game changer. This technology, which uses radar pulses to image subsurface structures, has revealed hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx in Egypt, undiscovered rooms in the Great Pyramid, entire towns buried under European cities, and anomalies that suggest tunnels and structures we have not yet excavated. What makes this technology powerful is that it produces data before excavation. It shows what is there without disturbing it, and increasingly, it is showing us that beneath our feet lies far more than we realized. LiDAR technology, light detection, and ranging operate similarly, but from above. Aircraft equipped with LiDAR can penetrate jungle canopy and vegetation to map the ground beneath. In the last decade, LiDAR surveys in Central America have revealed thousands of Mayan structures that were completely invisible from ground level. Entire cities, road networks, agricultural terraces, all hidden under rainforests that archaeologists assumed was pristine wilderness. The scale of Mayan civilization turned out to be far larger and more sophisticated than previous estimates suggested. If we were that wrong about the Maya, a civilization we knew existed and have been studying for over a century, what else are we wrong about? LiDAR surveys in the Amazon have produced similar revelations. Geometric earthworks called geoglyphs, vast cleared areas connected by roads, evidence of large-scale landscape modification. The Amazon was not an untouched wilderness. It was managed, perhaps even engineered, by societies we are only beginning to understand. And many of these structures are buried under layers of soil and vegetation, visible only through technology that can see beneath the surface. Antarctica presents another frontier. Ice core drilling and ground-penetrating radar have revealed anomalies beneath the ice sheet. Magnetic anomalies suggesting metallic structures or mineral deposits. Geometric patterns that some researchers interpret as potential ruins. Now, we need to be cautious here. Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years according to conventional geology. Any structures beneath the ice would necessarily be ancient beyond current human timelines. But ice coverage has varied over geological time. There were periods during interglacial warm phases when parts of Antarctica were ice-free. If any civilization existed during those windows, evidence would now be locked under miles of ice. Most researchers dismiss Antarctic structure theories as pseudoscience, and they may be right, but the refusal to even seriously investigate feels premature, given what technology could reveal. Meanwhile, crowdsourced research has become unexpectedly powerful. Ordinary people with internet access and curiosity have begun systematically analyzing historical photographs, old maps, and satellite imagery. They are finding patterns that professional archaeologists missed, not because academics are incompetent, but because there is too much data for small research teams to process. Thousands of volunteers scanning thousands of images can spot anomalies that would take professional teams decades to find. These citizen researchers have documented burial patterns across cities worldwide. They have collected photographic evidence of buildings with buried ground floors. They have correlated historical newspaper accounts of strange weather, unusual atmospheric phenomena, and unexplained ruins. They have built databases of World's Fair architecture, tracking which buildings were supposedly demolished and which might have been repurposed. The work is uneven, sometimes speculative, but the sheer volume of compiled evidence makes it difficult to dismiss entirely. The mud fossil theory represents one of the more controversial areas of ongoing investigation. Some researchers argue that many geological formations we interpret as natural might actually be remains of enormous organisms or even artificial structures that became petrified, Devil's Tower in Wyoming, conventionally explained as a volcanic plug, has been proposed by some as a fossilized tree stump based on its columnar structure. Giant's Causeway in Ireland, usually explained as basalt columns formed by cooling lava, has similarly been questioned. Now, mainstream geology has strong explanations for these formations, explanations backed by chemical analysis and understanding of igneous rock formation. The mud fossil theory, as currently articulated, lacks comparable rigor, but the underlying question is worth considering. Can we always distinguish between natural geological processes and the remnants of biological or artificial structures after millions of years of petrification? Our assumption that we can might be premature. What ties all these modern discoveries together is a common thread. The past was more complex than the simplified timeline we were taught. Civilizations rose and fell in cycles we are only beginning to map. Advanced capabilities appeared earlier than we thought possible, and burial, whether by natural catastrophe, deliberate covering, or slow accumulation, has hidden far more than we have uncovered. You do not need to accept every fringe theory to recognize the pattern. Mainstream archaeology itself keeps pushing dates backward, finding sophistication earlier, discovering that human capabilities are older and more widespread than previous models suggested. Each decade brings revelations that would have been dismissed as fantasy the decade before. The trend line points clearly toward a past that was richer, stranger, and more advanced than the linear progression from primitive to modern we were taught in school. Here is what you can do with this information. Look at your own city. Find the oldest buildings. Examine their foundations. Check if ground floor windows sit below modern street level. Visit local historical societies and ask about excavation records. Request access to old photographs. Most of this information is public. It just requires someone curious enough to ask. The evidence is not hidden in some government vault. It is under your feet, in public archives, visible in old buildings you walk past every day. The greatest suppression is not active censorship but passive inattention. We do not see what we do not look for. Start looking. You might be surprised what you find. So, where does all of this leave us? We have walked through buried cities, examined missing timelines, explored catastrophe theories, questioned forgotten empires, considered possible cover-ups, and looked at modern evidence that keeps surfacing despite our best efforts to ignore it. If you are feeling unsettled, that is appropriate. If you are feeling curious, that is even better. Because the truth, uncomfortable as it might be, is that we live in a world built on top of another world, and we have been living in it without realizing what lies beneath. Let us be clear about what we know versus what we suspect. We know buildings across the globe have their original ground floors buried beneath modern street level. This is documented, photographed, and undeniable. We know that massive quantities of sediment cover infrastructure that cannot be more than a few hundred years old based on architectural style and construction techniques. We know that population records, construction timelines, and material sourcing for the 1800s do not quite add up when you examine them closely. We know that maps from the 17 and 1800s show territorial designations that no longer exist and are poorly explained by modern historiography. We know that catastrophic events capable of burying cities, solar storms, magnetic excursions, impacts, volcanic eruptions, are not just possible but have happened multiple times in Earth's history. What we suspect, but cannot prove definitively, is that something significant occurred in the relatively recent past. Sometime in the late 1700s or early 1800s, an event or series of events fundamentally disrupted global civilization. This event buried cities under layers of mud and sediment, killed or displaced large populations, destroyed records, and forced survivors to rebuild with incomplete knowledge of what came before. The rebuilding happened quickly, perhaps because much of the infrastructure was still intact underground, requiring only excavation and repurposing. The historical narrative that emerged from this rebuilding period emphasized progress and construction, not rediscovery and salvage, because that narrative better served the political and economic interests of those in power during the reconstruction. This is not a fringe theory if you define theory properly. A theory is a framework that explains available evidence. The mud flood reset theory explains anomalies that the conventional historical narrative struggles with. It explains buried buildings, rapid urban development, architectural sophistication that seems ahead of its time, missing population sources, and the curious gaps in the documentary record. It does not explain everything perfectly, and it certainly does not have the institutional support or evidentiary weight of mainstream history. But it explains enough that dismissing it entirely requires ignoring a substantial body of physical evidence. The uncomfortable truth about history is that it has always been written by survivors. By definition, the people who lived through catastrophes, who retained power or gained it in the aftermath, are the ones who get to record what happened. Their perspective becomes the official account. The dead do not write memoirs. The displaced do not publish textbooks. The forgotten do not have advocates in academic institutions. So history develops blind spots, not through malicious conspiracy necessarily, but through the simple mechanics of who holds the pen. What else might be forgotten? That is the philosophical question this investigation raises. If an entire civilization, or multiple civilizations, could be buried and forgotten within just a few centuries, what does that say about the stability of knowledge? About the reliability of institutional memory? About our confidence that we understand the past? We assume that important knowledge persists, that significant events leave indelible marks on the historical record, that truth eventually surfaces. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if knowledge is far more fragile than we believe? What if catastrophe does not just destroy buildings and lives, but also erases memory, leaving only fragments that subsequent generations misinterpret or ignore? This should not lead to despair or nihilism. It should lead to humility and curiosity. Humility about what we claim to know with certainty. Curiosity about what might be hidden, forgotten, or deliberately obscured. The proper response to uncertainty is not to cling desperately to official narratives, nor is it to embrace every alternative theory uncritically. The proper response is to keep asking questions, to examine primary sources, to look at physical evidence, and to remain open to revision when new information emerges. There is hope in this perspective as well. If humanity has survived catastrophic resets before, if civilizations have risen from mud and ruin to rebuild sophisticated societies within generations, then we are far more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. The archaeological record shows this pattern repeatedly: collapse and recovery, destruction and rebuilding. The survivors always find a way forward, even if they do not fully understand what was lost. But there is also a warning. We might be approaching another reset. Climate change, regardless of its causes, is altering the planet in ways that will displace billions. Solar activity follows cycles we do not fully control or predict. The magnetic poles are moving faster than they have in recorded history. Seismic activity and volcanic eruptions continue along predictable fault lines and hotspots. Any of these factors, or a combination of them, could trigger cascading effects that disrupt civilization on a scale similar to what we have been discussing. Are we prepared? Do we have systems in place to preserve knowledge if centralized infrastructure fails? Have we learned anything from the resets that came before? The digitalization of information presents both opportunity and vulnerability. On one hand, knowledge is more accessible and distributed than ever before. Someone in a remote village can access the same information as a professor at an elite university. On the other hand, digital information is fragile. It requires constant energy, functional hardware, and intact networks. A major electromagnetic event, whether from solar activity or human conflict, could wipe out digital records instantly. The books we no longer print, the skills we no longer teach because we assume technology will always be available, these represent points of failure in our knowledge preservation system. Perhaps the most practical wisdom to take from this investigation is simple. Question narratives. Seek primary sources. Look at physical evidence. Do not assume that because something is taught widely, it is therefore true. Nor should you assume that because something is marginalized, it is therefore false. Truth exists independent of consensus. It waits patiently in buried buildings, in geological layers, in old photographs, and in the careful analysis of anyone willing to look closely enough. The buildings are still there. That is the profound reality underneath all of this. Whatever happened, whoever built these structures, Whatever knowledge they possessed, the physical evidence remains. It sits beneath our feet, incorporated into our infrastructure, visible in the architecture we walk past daily without really seeing. The mud that buried it also preserved it. And preservation means possibility, the possibility of rediscovery, the possibility of understanding, the possibility that we might learn from what was forgotten before we repeat the same cycles of rise and catastrophic fall. So, I want to leave you with an action, something tangible you can do with the questions this documentary has raised. Go outside. Find the oldest building in your area. Look at its foundation. Check whether the ground floor windows are at modern street level or below it. Photograph what you find. Visit your local historical society or library and ask to see old maps, old photographs of your city from the 1800s or early 1900s. Compare them to the present. Note the differences. Share what you discover, not as proof of any particular theory, but as data, as evidence that something in our understanding of recent history does not quite fit. The conversation about our past should not be controlled by institutions alone. It belongs to anyone curious enough to investigate. The past is not dead. It is not even past, to borrow a phrase. It is right here, waiting beneath a thin layer of soil and pavement and official narrative. All you have to do is look. Thank you for spending this time exploring these questions with me. If this investigation resonated with you, if it sparked curiosity or challenged assumptions in useful ways, I hope you will continue following Tales Before Tesla. We have more stories to uncover, more evidence to examine, more forgotten chapters of history waiting to be explored. The journey does not end here. In many ways, it is just beginning, because once you start seeing the patterns, once you start asking the uncomfortable questions, you cannot unsee them. You cannot unknow what you have learned. And that awareness, that willingness to question, that might be the most valuable inheritance we can receive from whatever civilization came before. Not their buildings or their technology, but their example. They built something magnificent. It was buried. And now we stand on top of it, slowly remembering. The evidence is under your feet. The choice of what to do with that knowledge is in your hands.